Hi, my name is David Hohn, and I am a picture book illustrator. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. I'd like to share with you my newest book. There we go, we got it in frame. Headstrong Hallie, the story of Hallie Morse Daggett, the first female fire guard. It's written by Aimee Bissonette and illustrated by me. I'm going to go ahead and read this story for you, and then afterwards I'll spend a little time discussing the process that went into creating the illustrations for this book. Headstrong Hallie, the story of Hallie Morse Daggett, the first female fire guard. Written by Aimee Bissonette, illustrated by David Hohn. Fire! Fire! Hallie leapt from her bed and raced to the window, pulling back the curtains. A bright orange glow filled the sky. Flames licked off the tops of far-off trees. Hallie's house was safe for now, but winds could shift at any moment. Even if her home was safe, the forest was in danger. The trees, the animals, her neighbors. Hallie raced to get dressed. She had to wake her sister, Leslie. The fire crews would be here soon. They had to be ready. Hallie had to help save her forest home. Hallie Morse Daggett never feared the forest. Certainly not. She hiked among the tall trees of California's Siskiyou Mountains, listened for calls of familiar birds, and looked for signs of wildlife. She fished the rushing Salmon River with her brother Ben and sister Leslie. She was an expert shot who loved to hunt. There was only one thing Hallie feared: fire. And summer was the worst time of all for forest fires. Hallie had seen the horrible power of fire race through the trees, leaving them scorched and leafless. She had seen the animals of the forest scatter and flee from racing flames, deers and foxes, rabbits and tiny mice, and she had seen those flames come dangerously close to her family's home. So, whenever the U.S. Forest Service crews came to fight the fires, Hallie joined the fight. She and Leslie stamped out abandoned campfires. They brought food and supplies to the men at the fire line. Fire was a constant worry in Hallie's life. At night, in bed, with the smell of smoke thick in the air, Hallie vowed to do more. Who knew the mountains better than she did? Who would protect them and keep her friends and family safe? Hallie decided she would work for the U.S. Forest Service when she grew up. What kind of girl dreams a dream like that? A headstrong girl, for sure. When Hallie and Leslie were older, they went to boarding school in San Francisco. School was fine, but the city life was not for Hallie. Frilly dresses and feathered hats were not her style. She craved the smell of fir trees and wooded trails. She missed the roar of the Salmon River. As soon as she finished school, Hallie began mailing letters to the U.S. Forest Service. She wanted to work. She wanted to help fight fires. But the Forest Service said no. A few years later, tragedy struck. The Great Fire of 1910 burned millions of acres of forest in Washington, Idaho, and Montana. Fanned by hurricane-force winds, the fire destroyed entire towns. People died, most of them firefighters. Hallie was more determined than ever. She wrote more letters. The Forest Service needed someone like Hallie, she told them. She had grown up in the mountains. She knew forest fires and the dangers they posed. She simply would not take no for an answer. But no was always the answer she got. The Forest Service didn't hire women. In 1913, Hallie finally got her break. The man who was the fire lookout at Eddy Gulch Lookout Station quit to take a better paying job right before the start of fire season. Hallie knew the Forest Service would act quickly to fill the post. She sat down and wrote her most heartfelt letter yet. Ranger M.H. McCarthy received 3 applications for the Eddy Gulch Fire Lookout job. In addition to Hallie, 2 men applied. Ranger McCarthy carefully reviewed all 3 applications, then sent his recommendation to his boss. "I hope your heart is strong enough to stand the shock. It is this. One of the most untiring and enthusiastic applicants which I have for the position is Miss Hallie Morse Daggett, a wide-awake woman of 30 years who knows and has traversed every trail on the Salmon River watershed, and is thoroughly familiar with every foot of the district. She is not afraid of anything that walks, creeps, or flies. She is a perfect lady in every respect." Hallie got the job. News spread that Hallie would be the new lookout at Eddy Gulch. It caused quite a stir. Some of the Forest Service men made bets that she would quit within a few days. They were sure Hallie would be frightened by the fierce electrical storms atop the mountain. They were sure that she would be lonely at the isolated station where days or even weeks could pass without seeing another human being. They didn't know Hallie. Hallie loved the tiny lookout cabin from the first time she saw it. The Eddy Gulch station was on the top of the peak that overlooked Hallie's girlhood home. The view from the cabin took Hallie's breath away. To the east was magnificent Mount Shasta, at more than 14,000 feet high. To the west, the Pacific Ocean. Hallie's cabin became home to pet chipmunks that ate out of her hand and raided her pockets for corn or biscuits. A pair of porcupines made their way into the cabin each night, too, no matter what Hallie did to keep them out. There were larger animals, such as bears and coyotes in the area, too. One morning, Hallie discovered a large panther track out on the trail. Hallie started wearing her gun out on walks after that. Hallie loved her fire lookout work. Each morning, Hallie raised the American flag. She gathered firewood and fetched water from a nearby spring. Sometimes a hunter, camper, or fellow forest guard would come by to visit. And Leslie made the 3-hour climb up the mountain on horseback every week to bring Hallie newspapers, supplies, and letters from home. By day, Hallie watched for smoke. At night, she watched for the red glare of fire, which she described as red stars in the blue-black background of moonless nights. 3 times a day, Hallie telephoned Ranger McCarthy from the pole-mounted telephone outside her cabin, more often if she spotted smoke or flame. In her first season on the job, Hallie spotted 40 fires. Because of her quick reporting, fewer than 5 acres of forest burned. Hallie worked the 1913 fire season at Eddy Gulch Lookout Station and 14 more seasons after that. She arrived every spring when it was so cold that the streams were frozen over and Hallie had no source of water. Hallie used shovels to fetch snow to melt instead. She stayed until late fall when the snow fell again and there was no longer a fire danger. When the fire season ended and it was time to make her way back down the mountain, Hallie faced her return to civilization with sadness. In 1927, the Forest Service replaced the tiny Eddy Gulch lookout cabin with a new building. The new building sat high off the ground and had a catwalk wrapped around it. It had walls of glass and a new Osborne firefinder, a tool that helped Hallie map and determine distances to fires. It provided a spectacular view of the forest below. But to Hallie, the new lookout station no longer felt like home. It was no more her style than the frilly dresses and feathered hats she had worn at boarding school. Hallie's first season in the new building was her last. Hallie retired in 1927 with no regrets. From the time she was little, she had dreamed of a life where she would protect the mountains and the forests she loved. She knew what she wanted and she followed her heart, even when that meant doing things others wouldn't or didn't want to do. And in the end, she found a place in the world that was just right for her. What kind of girl dreams a dream like that? A wonderfully headstrong one, for sure. All right. Well, what I'd like to do now is show you the process of creating the illustrations for this book, starting with the text that I received from Aimee and the publisher, all the way through to the finished art that gets printed in the book. Every picture book starts with the text. This is the story as it was written by Aimee Bissonette and sent to Sleeping Bear Press. My editor at Sleeping Bear Press sends this to me, and the very first thing that I'll do is I'll take all these sentences, all these paragraphs, and divide it up into which text is going to go onto which page. The next process is to lay out the entire book, for me to kind of figure out what's going to happen on each page. Now, a big part of what's going to happen is indicated in the words of the text. Like at the very beginning, it says that there is a fire going on. And so I want to make sure that this first illustration has a fire in it, but I also want to introduce Hallie into the image. And I do that for every single page. Now, these are not particularly good drawings, and nobody except for me, well, and now you, ever see these drawings. I don't send these to my publisher. But it's a great way for me to just kind of begin to be like, I think that we should show, a landscape with the animals running away from the fire, or this should be the moment when Hallie sees the lookout cabin for the very first time. And it's just me kind of figuring out what's going to go on each page. And a lot of these drawings will change pretty dramatically from here to the end of the book. Once I've decided that, once I've figured out what I like on each one, I will then do basically a draw over. I'll take those exact same drawings and I will put a piece of tracing paper on top of it and tighten them up just a little bit more. And I'll zoom in on some of these. You can see that they're a little finer. They've gotten just a little bit more detailed, a little bit clearer. This is what my publisher sees for the first time. This is where I'll put this into a book format and send it off and say, what do you think? This is what I think should be happening on each page. And I will get a lot of great feedback from my editor and art director where they say, oh yeah, that's a great idea. We'd love this page. Or they'll say like, oh, I think we could make some changes to this particular page and make it that much more interesting, that much more effective. We'll be able to tell the story that Aimee's written that much more impactfully. Now, once those black and white sketches have been approved, I'll move on to color studies. And this is basically going right on top of those very sketchy, rough initial sketches and just adding color on top of it. And this is a great opportunity for me to see how the whole book is looking. Like, does it have the feel from the beginning? Am I catching the sense of wonder and majesty that I want the first time she's hiking through the mountains as a kid? Do I have the sort of the intensity and kind of terror that happens as a forest catches on fire? Am I capturing the feeling that Hallie has when she sees the lookout cabin for the first time, or as she's seeing leaving the cabin and just retiring from being a fire watch guard? And so this is a great opportunity to explore color, to change it around. I change it a lot. None of these are ever the very first one that I do. There's probably 4 or 5 changes to every single one of these as I explore different color combinations, different ways of lighting it, all the things that go into creating the mood and the feeling for each individual illustration. But once I've figured this out, and this will be sent off to my art director and editor as well, and they'll give their thoughts on it. Once this has been laid out, this is really my map. I've pretty much made all the hard decisions. And from here on out, it's really just about executing the finished art. So let's take one of the spreads from this book and kind of step through how I'm creating the finished art. This is the very rough sketch that was initially approved by my art director. I will take that sketch and I'll lay it out on, I use a program called Photoshop. I'm doing most of my paintings using digital media. And I will lay it out. I'll make it a little bit, quite a bit bigger actually. I'll make it a little bit bigger than the size that it'll be printed in the book. And I'll blow that up and then I'll fade that back, and by putting just a piece of tracing paper, in this case it's just a filter over the top of it, and then just using a digital version of a regular pencil, I will go through and just do a tighter drawing. And you can just kind of see how I'm working with what I already have, but I'm just tightening it up, putting the features in proportion, making sure that everything is sitting nicely on the page. At this stage, I have what I think of as a finished sketch. It's a pretty tight drawing of the illustration on that page, almost like almost like a coloring book. The line work is all there. Everything has been kind of figured out. I will go through and then, utilizing my color study. So if I pop over here, here's my color study, and I'll just use, there's a little eyedropper tool over here, and I'll sample colors and bring them over and start blocking them into underneath the line sketch. So I've got my drawing on one layer, and I've got my colors, my basic simple colors, on its own layer underneath. And all I'm really doing here is simply choosing the color I've already decided on in my color sketch, and then just filling it in to here. There's a fair amount of pushing and pulling and blending of colors, but it really is kind of as simple as you doing it just like you would if you were using crayons in a coloring book. Once I've got that where I want it to go, the finished artwork is going to feel more like a watercolor. And so what I'll do is I will actually utilize a watercolor texture. This is a physical painting that I've made and I've scanned in, and it's a simple watercolor, just a big sheet of watercolor ink and texture that I've painted and then scanned in and then laid over the top of it. And so now it's looking a little bit more like a watercolor, right? But not really just yet. It doesn't have the kind of nuance and detail that I'm looking for. Certainly not what's currently in this color study. So I'll then take, in Photoshop, I'm continuing to use Photoshop, a watercolor brush. This is a special brush that emulates the feeling of watercolor. And I'll go ahead and start painting into the image. Let me zoom in so it's a little easier to see. I'll just turn that layer on and off. And you can just see that I'm starting to add in more modeling. The forms are getting more three-dimensional. On top of that, I'll go ahead and add in some colored pencil. And this is, again, just a special brush that I'm using from within Photoshop. This happens to be one that I built myself. I just designed it to look like a colored pencil on a rough tooth paper. You'll notice that the black line, my original line sketch, is kind of heavy duty there. So in physical art, if I was doing this as a traditional physical media watercolor painting, I would probably erase that pencil work. And so digitally, I'm just doing that by kind of pushing it back a little bit. We're almost there. It's getting pretty close to being done. I'm going to come in on top of it with a little opaque gouache. This is exactly what I would do if I was doing a physical media painting. I'd lay in most of my work with a pencil. I'd go in on top of it with watercolor. I would go in on top of that with a colored pencil. And then on top of that, I would go in with a little bit of gouache. And these are just for these heavy opaque elements. And then right on top of that, I might end up with a little bit of, I'll zoom out on this one just a little bit. I would probably add in a little bit of spatter on top of it. And this is giving me all that lovely gritty texture that's going to make up the fire that's happening in the reflection in the window. There's a little bit of smoky haze. It's mostly just some more watercolor textures that I've painted on physical paper and then scanned in. And that takes us to the end of the piece. We've got the beginning. I'll just step through it one more time. We've got the laid-based colors. We've got a little watercolor paint on top of that. We've got a little bit of our pencil sketch on top of that. Some overall texture. A little bit more watercolor. Some opaque gouache paint. A little bit of colored pencil. And then just some spatter. And each image gets built up in exactly this same way, really based on the way that I have done physical media for many, many years prior to making the slow transition to digital and utilizing, every single one of these little color studies that really gives me my roadmap. And this is the finished file that would get sent off to the publisher and would then get printed in the book. So thank you for hanging out with me this afternoon and reading Headstrong Hallie, and for giving me a chance to show you how I create the illustrations that go into every one of my books. Happy reading, everybody.